Now, weapons manufactured in Canberra are being sold to the United Arab Emirates. The Middle East country's military has been accused by the United Nations of war crimes during the 5-year Yemen war. For more on this, we're speaking to Dr. Sue Wareham, who is the president of the Medical Association for Prevention of War and joins us now from Canberra. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with us. Before we begin, just tell us, how did you react to news that an Australian company could be shipping certain weapons to the UAE?
Well, this is pretty awful, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. This is pretty awful news, but in a way it's a bit of a wake-up call about Australia's weapons export policies generally. And I think the important part of all of this is to look at what's the significance of this and what's actually happening on the ground in Yemen. And we know reports from the United Nations and other aid agencies, Save the Children and others, that this is an unprecedented humanitarian disaster to which Australia seems to be contributing by our weapons export policies in enabling weapons to go to two of the key countries, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, which are involved in the bombing of Yemen, a country where we see 22 million people in urgent need of humanitarian aid. These are civilians primarily. Shocking statistics from Save the Children, an estimate of 85,000 children who've died from famine and associated impacts of the war. And what we know about modern warfare is that civilians are the primary victims, and that's exactly what's happening in Yemen. There are attacks on healthcare centres, degradation of healthcare, and children are paying the price in very large numbers. So for Australia to be contributing to this catastrophe by arming and continuing to arm the countries that are bombing Yemen, this really is pretty shocking and unconscionable, we would say.
I just want to pick you up on that particular report. Now, we know the humanitarian crisis in Yemen is ongoing. You've pretty much detailed it there. However, this report found that EOS was exporting these weapons to the UAE. The report did not contain evidence that the armaments were being used in the Yemen conflict. Why then should EOS be held responsible for what their client is doing with the product that they've bought?
Well, I think that's a bit of a cop-out if EOS are arguing that. I mean, the bottom line is that Australia is selling weapons to countries that are accused of war crimes or gross violations of human rights. And that's a very serious allegation. And it's a situation that Australia should not be in.
But just on that point as well, when a company manufactures armaments, at some point there's a very high probable chance that that armament will end up in a conflict. That's what weapons armament companies do. Should all Australian weapons manufacturers then just stop their business? Is that what you're suggesting?
One of the important things is to look at whether the recipients of our weapons are actually complying with the rules of war. Even warfare has rules, international humanitarian law. And the evidence is that Saudi Arabia and Emirates are not complying with the rules of war. They are committing gross violations of human rights in their war on Yemen. And this is the important fact that we need to understand, that Australia should not be exporting weapons to countries that are not complying with the laws of warfare.
As I understand it, EOS's product is actually bought and produced and distributed by an American company. So that being the case, are you suggesting that Australian defence companies shouldn't be selling to American companies who are then selling it on to these other countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia?
Well, this gets into a bigger argument about, and you've identified a very significant problem with the arms trade, which is that when we export weapons, we might think they're going to a particular destination, whereas what happens to them when they leave Australia is really anybody's guess. And there's a big problem with weapons changing hands on the battlefield or somewhere in between. Now, one of the problems with Australia's export policies is that the Australian government doesn't follow up once a licence to export is granted, then there's really virtually no follow-up after that. So we don't know what happens to our weapons, or if the government knows, they're certainly not telling us, and the issue of secrecy is another big problem in this area. But we need to recognise that when we export weapons, who knows where they will eventually end up, and it may not be the person to whom whom we regard as the initial recipient.
Well, just going on that particular argument, Ms. Wareham, would you be comfortable if Australia's defence companies were to provide armaments to Australia's military, which were then used in conflict by the Australian military?
We're not arguing for a policy whereby our military...
No, I'm just trying to understand, when can a particular armament or weapon that is produced by an Australian defence company be used? When are you comfortable for those circumstances to happen?
Well, there are legitimate uses for weapons, and there are legitimate uses for...
Such as?
In wars which fulfil the requirements of either being UN Security Council authorised, or
would you be able to
when
give
a
us an
country
example of those sort of wars?
Well, to be honest, if one looks at the recent wars, particularly the wars in which Australia has been involved, then it's hard to regard them as legitimate. But we are arguing not for a no weapons policy, of course. Not many people would agree to that. But we are arguing for much stricter scrutiny of where our weapons are going. And when our weapons are sold, in this case by the company EOS, and we know now that they're ending up in either Saudi Arabia or Emirates, and that was via a fairly complex deal with a US company, then we're arguing that that is wrong.
I find it interesting that, you know, you talk about Yemen, you talk about the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, of course, pretty much very well known, and you are talking about the weapons that are being used by the UAE, talking about the weapons being used by Saudi Arabia as well. How would you feel if you were to find out, and again, I cannot say whether this is real or not, but I'm just trying to understand your argument as to when an Australian defence product can be used. Would it be all right to be used during, say, a Somali civil war, which is ongoing at the moment, the civil war in Nigeria, the Iraqi civil insurgency, the South Sudanese civil war, or the Libyan civil war? If a civil war, would that be all right? Or just a conflict, an international conflict, and that's when the, Australian defence or armaments should not be used?
Well, it's clearly a case-by-case decision, but the argument that we're stating is that there needs to be much more transparency around this, so that the Australian people and even Australian parliamentarians know what we are exporting to whom and how is it being used. So one can't really give a blanket answer to that question. It needs to be case by case. But as far as we, the Australian people, can determine, we just don't know. We don't have access to information, even historical information, about how decisions are made. What are the risk assessments that are in place, in this case, in relation to selling to Saudi Arabia and Emirates? What did the government take into account? We don't know any of these things. It's all shrouded in secrecy of commercial in confidence, which is really a smokescreen. So there need to be much tighter regulations, and there needs to be greater transparency around this, so that parliamentarians in Australia and the Australian people can have some input into this discussion.
That being the case, how can the average Australian ensure that their investment is not going to supporting a conflict overseas?
Well, I think we need to make it clear to our government that we expect tighter regulations around our military exports, and there are some particular customers, in this case United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who should not be receiving Australian weapons, because that's pretty unconscionable. But we expect to have greater input into this discussion, and we would like to see a review of the whole of Australia's weapons export policies, because clearly they're not working in the interests of international peace and security.
Sue Wareham of Association for Prevention of War, thank you so much for sharing your insight with us.
Thank you very much for having me.